Be seated, please. Okay, we have all of our jurors present, the defendant and the attorneys are present, so we'll proceed with the trial this afternoon. State may call its next witness.
I'd call Tanner Arthaud, Your Honor.
Mr. Arthaud, if you would come forward right up here to receive the oath, please. Raise your right hand.
Do you swear the testimony you're about to give will be the truth, the whole truth, and nothing but the truth, so help you God?
I do.
Thank you. Have a seat.
Have a seat, please.
All right, thank you.
State may examine.
Can you please state your full name and spell your last name?
Tanner Noel Arthaud, Arthaud.
Tanner, where did you work in April 1st of 2019?
Metro Area Ambulance Service.
Do you currently work there?
No, I do not.
Did you recently move?
I did, yes.
Where do you live now?
Duluth, Minnesota.
At the time of April 1st, 2019, how long had you worked at Metro Area Ambulance?
2.5 years.
And in what capacity did you work for them?
What do you mean by that?
What was your job?
Okay, I was a full-time paramedic for them.
So you're a trained or licensed paramedic?
Yes, yep.
And as a paramedic, what would your job duties be for Metro Area Ambulance?
The first thing first is just ensuring that our coverage area is adequately staffed and ready to respond to any calls, and that all our equipment is stocked and ready to go. And then just waiting for dispatch. Once we're dispatched, we figure out what unit is the closest and most appropriate to respond to that call. And then with the information from dispatch, we decide how we respond to that call in a safely effective manner. And then once we get on scene, we ensure scene safety and that we have all the equipment and resources that we need. And then we get to the patient and start treating and transporting.
With regard to the sort of coverage area of Metro Area Ambulance, does that include the city of Mandan?
Yes, it does.
Do you remember taking a call in your capacity as a paramedic with Metro Area Ambulance on April 1st, 2019 to RJR?
Yes, I do.
Do you remember approximately what time you were dispatched out?
7:28.
Who was with you that day?
Kylan Williams.
And in what capacity was Mr. Williams serving?
He was my EMT basic partner.
So what's the difference between a paramedic and an EMT?
A paramedic is an additional 1.5 years of education, and paramedics are advanced life support, and EMTs are basic.
So on that day, was Mr. Williams essentially assisting you?
We were working together as a team.
What information did you have as you responded to RJR?
We were dispatched for a male that was unresponsive.
And unresponsive, does that cover a lot of territory?
It does. There's a lot of different things that can cause unresponsiveness. When we were going en route, we were told that CPR was in progress.
Okay, so what did that indicate to you as a paramedic?
That we were going to run a medical cardiac arrest is what we were anticipating, which is very common.
When you responded, I presume that you were in an ambulance?
Yes, we were.
Did you have your lights or sirens activated?
Yes, we did.
Did you respond essentially code?
We responded code 3, which is lights and sirens, which is fast and emergent, but cautiously.
How quickly did you arrive at RJR?
It was about 2 to 3 minutes. We were on the strip in Mandan, actually, when we were dispatched.
When you arrived at RJR Maintenance and Management, how did you know where to go?
We arrived into the parking lot on the west side, and there was a bystander that was waving us in, and there was a door that was open.
Do you have any idea who that bystander was?
No idea.
And when you said he was waving you into a door that was open, on what side of the building was that door?
That would have been on the west side.
What type of door was that?
It was just a normal door next to the shop door.
So did it enter into the shop itself?
Yes.
Did you immediately go inside on arriving?
Yes, we did.
Did you take anything with you?
Yes, we grabbed all of our appropriate medical equipment, our airway bag, medication bag, our cardiac monitor, everything that we needed to do to manage a patient that was in cardiac arrest.
Now, when you went inside that shop door, what did you first see?
The shop seemed pretty empty. It seemed just like a normal warehouse, a normal shop. When we walked in, I saw an individual performing CPR.
And as you walked into that door at RJR, where did you see that?
It would have been off to our left-hand side.
Okay. Was anybody else standing around inside at that time?
I didn't notice anybody.
So you noticed an individual performing CPR on
Yes.
a second individual.
Yes.
Did you approach the individual performing CPR?
Yes, I did.
And what did you do at that time?
I was just assessing the patient that he was performing CPR on. I noticed that there was a large amount of blood coming from his oropharynx and around his body.
What does that signify to you?
There can be a lot of things that can cause blood coming out of an airway. Sometimes just doing CPR can cause blood coming out of an airway. So I was trying to further assess the situation and see what was causing that.
Was that something that you had expected on responding to a cardiac call?
No.
Did you or Mr. Williams take over CPR at any point?
Yes. Kylan took over doing CPR.
And what were you doing at that time?
Well, initially I was asking the bystander that was doing CPR. I asked him if he witnessed what happened. He replied he did not. I asked him if he knew how long this individual has been here. He did not.
And why did you ask him those questions?
Those are very pertinent because if somebody witnesses somebody going to cardiac arrest, we can understand a cause, how long it's been, if they fell and hit their head, a lot of things that can happen that would cause the individual and potential injuries.
So it would affect the treatment that you'd provide?
Yes.
In this case, you weren't getting any of that information, so what did you have to do next?
The first thing I did was I assessed a carotid pulse, and I assessed for breathing.
When you did that, what was the result?
I was unable to palpate a carotid pulse, and the patient was apneic.
What does that signify to you?
The patient is not breathing, zero respiratory effort, zero perfusing cardiac effort.
In layman's terms, what does that mean?
Your heart can still be pumping, but if you don't have enough circulation in your body, you might not feel a pulse, or your heart might be completely stopped.
So at that time, without knowing how long this had been going on, you're still in life-saving mode.
Absolutely. Yep.
So while Mr. Williams is providing the EMT is providing or doing CPR, and you're continuing with the assessment process, then what did you do?
I opened up the individual shirt to place the defibrillator pads on, and I noticed 3 punctured wounds to his anterior portion of his chest.
Is that something you were expecting to see in responding to a cardiac call?
Absolutely not.
When you see these puncture wounds, how does that affect your treatment?
That goes from medical to a traumatic injury, so that changes a lot.
How so?
Basically, we're trying to figure out how much blood loss, what part of the body was injured, did it hit the heart, lungs, etc.
Okay. And you've talked about this individual. Do you know who that individual was?
His name was Robert.
Okay. And you mentioned that when you opened his shirt, you noticed these puncture wounds. Where
Yes.
on the body were they?
I remember that I believe he had 2 on his left side and 1 on his right side.
To the chest region?
Yes.
At that time, when it switches to a traumatic type call, or I guess call, how does that change? You said it changes things a lot, but how does it change things for you?
The probability of coming back from a traumatic arrest is significantly less than a medical arrest.
And you mean the patient being revived?
Yes.
So how does it affect what you do or what life-saving techniques you perform?
With traumatic arrest, it's still circulation, and then we need to find and hopefully reverse and treat the traumatic injuries.
In this case, what did you do?
I placed occlusive dressings over his puncture wounds initially.
And to explain to the jury what that means, what are they like giant sort of clear bandages?
I honestly just use the defib pads over them to just prevent any more air building up and causing more thoracic trauma.
So you say
internally.
defib pads, the defibrillator pads?
Mm-hmm.
Are they adhesive pads?
Yes.
How big are they?
About the size of a hand.
Okay. Okay. So you put those over the puncture wounds, if I'm understanding you?
I did one on the left side because that was the same location that you placed the pads on, so it worked out.
Was Robert still bleeding when you were on scene?
I didn't notice any continuous hemorrhaging
Okay.
at the time.
While you were assessing Robert, were you looking around for a possible cause of those injuries?
Yes, my partner Kylan and I, we just stopped and we looked around the shop and we were trying to figure out if something could have caused these injuries, like if something could have fallen off of a wall that might have hit the patient in the chest. But
Were you able to see anything like that?
we didn't note anything, no.
When you began working on Robert, was his body still warm?
Yes.
What does that signify to you?
It gives us an idea of a potential downtime.
In the regard of a warm body, how does that help you? Sorry.
If the patient is still warm to the touch, it means that he was still adequately perfusing not that long ago.
So he still had circulation not that long ago?
Potentially, yeah.
Okay. Are you able to put any approximation on time?
No.
At any point, did you stop working on Robert on the floor of RJR?
Yes, I did.
Why did you do that?
The scene was unsafe.
Why was it unsafe?
When we were performing our resuscitative efforts on Robert initially, additional Mandan police officers entered the shop, and I asked them if they could make sure that the scene was safe. That was my number one priority at that time. And when we were working him, I heard from one of the officers that there was another body found. As soon as I heard that, I knew that it is going to be a MCI, and I need to triage, but we were in a hot zone. So we needed to get out of the hot zone and find a safe place to go.
And what's an MCI?
Mass casualty incident.
Because there's more than one body.
Yes, we
More
only
than
had
one
one
victim.
crew, and then there were additional bodies.
You'd said earlier, I think your phrase was that more officers arrived. Were there already officers on scene at that time?
Yes, there was one officer that arrived shortly after we got there.
What was that individual doing?
That individual walked in. He asked what he can do to help. I asked him if he can ensure that the scene is safe. We all looked around. Nothing seemed out of the ordinary, and he helped doing CPR.
Were people roaming around at that time?
I was so focused on taking care of my patient, I didn't notice if anybody else was walking around the shop.
So you'd stated that additional law enforcement arrived on scene. You'd asked them to secure the scene.
Yes.
So what did you and your team do at that time?
When they were just sweeping the scene, we continued to work on Robert. And then once they said that there were additional bodies, we left to a safer position.
When you left the scene, or you left working on Robert and you were essentially cleared from that area, was everybody else also cleared from the building?
I don't remember seeing anybody except for law enforcement officers in the shop area.
Okay. Were you allowed back in at any time?
Yes.
And what was the purpose in that?
I needed to assess the other individuals and see if there was anybody that was still viable to attempt resuscitative efforts on.
Did you have Robert pronounced dead on April 1st, 2019?
Yes.
Why did you do that?
It was prolonged downtime from when we worked him. I was maybe 8 minutes after I stopped resuscitative efforts until I went back to assess him. He was showing a systole on the monitor the entire time, and his injuries were incompatible with life at that moment.
At the time, you used some terms that I don't know.
I apologize about that.
No problem. Were there at any point of time from when you responded and you began working on Robert until you essentially had him declared deceased, did he show any signs of life?
No.
Is that what you were just telling us?
Yes.
Okay.
Sorry.
No worries. Now you said that you went in to assess the other individuals that were
Yes.
found. Were you accompanied by law enforcement at that time?
Yes, there was law enforcement officers in the office area, and then my partner was also with me, Kylan.
Okay. When you go to assess an individual that potentially might need resuscitative efforts. What does that encompass?
So when you're dealing with mass casualty incidences, there were more than one patient. So if they don't have a pulse, we don't work them. If they have a pulse and they're not breathing, we do a jaw thrust maneuver. And if they're breathing, then we can work them if they come back from that. But otherwise, they're declared dead right there.
And I believe you said that you'd walked into the office area and law enforcement was present.
Correct.
And with you was Kylan Williams?
Correct.
Okay. At that time, which body did you go to first?
The first individual that we saw was a female patient laying on her back, kind of in the office with her feet facing out towards it.
And what did you do regarding that individual?
Kylan went in front of me and assessed the patient. I noticed a large laceration to her neck, and Kylan was unable to palpate a pulse. I moved on to the next individual.
Okay. Do you remember that female's name?
I do not know.
Okay. At that point, you weren't able to provide any care?
No.
Okay. So you moved on to the next individual, and where was that individual located?
He was in a separate office.
And how was he positioned when you saw him?
He was laying on his back in the office.
Where in the office?
I believe it was next to a desk. I don't 100% recall.
Okay. How far into the office? Do you remember?
I don't know.
Okay. And what did you do with regard to that individual?
I tried to assess for circulation. I went to go palpate a radial pulse. He was cold to the touch. And then I noticed that there was blood on his shirt, so I opened up his shirt, and then I noticed a large amount of puncture wounds to his chest. Those injuries are not compatible with life. I moved on to the next individual.
So both of the two individuals that you located in the office were already deceased?
Yes.
And you just mentioned that the male individual, the second individual in the office, was cold to the touch. What does that
Yes.
signify to you?
That his body has not been perfusing appropriate circulation for an extended amount of time.
Do you have any estimate on how much time that would be?
No, I don't.
Okay. Are you able to compare that versus Robert Faulkner's body?
I can try to think of a way to compare, I guess, but Robert's body was more close to a normal person's body temperature. And then the other individual was, I guess, just cold.
And to you, you
Cool.
stated that indicates one's been deceased longer than the other. Or
It's
not
just a
circulating.
lack of perfusion.
After you assessed the two individuals in the office area of RJR and they had wounds not consistent or compatible with life, where did you go?
Then I discovered that there was another body in the shop area. So I went over there and assessed that individual.
And at the time that you assessed that individual, I guess, where was his body positioned in relation to where Robert's body was?
The fourth individual's body was closer towards the north end of the shop, and it was right below a shelving unit attached to the wall.
Were you able to see that fourth individual's body while you were working on Robert?
Not while I was working on Robert, no, it was out of sight from where we were.
When you assessed that fourth individual, do you remember his name?
I do not.
When you assessed that individual, what was his condition?
He was cold and stiff.
What does that signify to you?
The patient had rigor mortis set in, which would equal a longer prolonged downtime.
Did you do any other assessment other than to, I guess, see that he was cold and that he was stiff?
Initially, he was laying on his stomach. We did roll him onto his back to appropriately assess him.
And when you did that, did you notice any injuries as you did with the other two? Or three, excuse me?
I didn't look too far in depth. I just knew that he was cold and his body was stiff and there was nothing I was going to do, so I just moved on.
When you were assessing these individuals, were you gloved?
Yes.
Other than assessing each of the bodies for signs of life, did you take or move or touch them in any way?
No, just for assessment purposes.
Did you remove anything from the crime scene that you hadn't brought there?
No.
When you were clearing the RJR Maintenance and Management building, did you leave anything behind?
I believe we might have left some medical equipment, like a intraosseous needle we left in the patient's leg, but other than that, not that I recall.
When you were assessing first Robert's body, then the two in the office, and then the fourth body, and Mr. Williams was with you, were other people just milling about RJR?
I didn't notice anybody in the shop. There were people outside of the shop.
Okay. But nobody was in the shop at that time?
Not that I recall, no.
And when you left RJR, were those people standing outside?
Yes.
Were law enforcement on scene at that time?
Law enforcement was on scene, and I know that law enforcement was working on crowd control and just kind of getting people away from the scene.
Based on previous calls that you've taken, or essentially crime scenes that you worked, is that pretty typical?
It can be, yeah, depending on where the nature of the call's at. Like in this time, everybody was coming into work, so.
Tanner, were you ever asked to provide shoe prints in this
Yes.
case? Did you do that?
Yes.
To your knowledge, did Mr. Williams do that?
Yes.
Do you remember why that was?
I can make assumptions, but
Did anybody ever tell you why that was?
they just wanted to track our shoes so they can compare our boots to other potential boots on the site and see if there were any boot prints that didn't match up to anybody.
Other than walking from essentially body to body in RJR and coming in and out the door, did you go anywhere else in the RJR premises that day?
Nope. Just the necessary locations.
And as far as you know, anybody that was with you, as far as your EMT or fire personnel or law enforcement, did you see them doing that?
From what I recall, everybody was just working on a mission and enforcing that everything was safe and that we could do our jobs efficiently.
Once you assessed each of these individuals and Robert was pronounced dead, you couldn't do anything for the other three. What do you have any next steps in that case?
No. We cleared the scene. Law enforcement took over the scene from us because now it's a crime scene. And then we just work on getting our ambulance put back together and take the next call.
That's all the questions that I have for this witness, Judge.
The defense may cross-examine. Mr. Quick?
Yes, Judge, thank you. Mr. Arthaud, as I understand it, you were dispatched at 7:28 and you arrived at 7:31, according to the log that you have. Would that sound about right?
Correct.
And it looks like you actually left about 7:50.
Correct.
So you were there a little bit less than 20 minutes.
Correct.
And you go initially with Kylan Williams, your EMT, and you're the paramedic, correct?
Correct.
And you go in there, somebody from RJR, presumably a bystander, opens the door for you. You go in, and an employee is doing CPR.
Correct.
When's the next person that enters the room in terms of time? Do you remember a firefighter coming in shortly thereafter?
Yes.
And do you remember who that was?
Derek Berger.
Correct. And after the fire, was the police officer that was also helping with CPR there before that first firefighter or after?
I don't exactly recall who came in first.
But it was pretty close in time.
Correct.
And Derek Berger was a firefighter, correct?
Yes.
Was he dispatched alone in that truck? Or was
Yes,
there...
he was.
Okay.
He was at Engine 2 in Mandan.
Okay. So he's there, Officer Tessness is there, and they both are assigned some responsibility for this resuscitation on Robert, correct?
Correct.
And you're all doing some things, right?
Yes.
And you're all standing over top of him doing these things, correct?
Yes, we're all providing patient care.
And there's quite a bit of blood in this area,
There is, yeah.
and there's a number of broken eggs. Do you recall that?
I wasn't sure what they were, so I
Okay.
didn't really comment on it.
Okay, but it was broken something, some yellow substance laying there?
Yeah,
Do you recall that?
I do.
And then, before there's any other police officers there, there's another fire crew there, correct?
Yes, 2 additional firefighters came to help us.
And that would, do you remember their names?
Kylan and Schaff.
Okay, and they were there again even before there were more police officers, correct?
I don't exactly recall the
Okay.
time frames, but
But at some point, there's 3 Mandan police officers at some point, correct?
yes,
And you're doing, with all this help from others, resuscitation efforts on Robert, correct?
correct.
And at this point, nobody has cleared the scene.
Nope,
And at some point, somebody goes back into this separate area of the RGR building, which is the office area. When I mean somebody, it's a police officer, I presume.
yes,
And they find 2 additional bodies.
correct.
And then you are advised, as are the other rescuers that are in the shop, that there's other bodies in the office, correct?
Yes.
And you're still doing resuscitation efforts on Robert,
Up until the moment that we are informed that there are additional bodies, then that's when we stopped.
okay? And at that point, you are responsible for the team that's there. There's 3 firemen, there's you, there's your EMT. So you literally walk outside the building for a very short time until law enforcement tells you it's safe to return.
I stepped outside of the building,
Okay.
and then I went back in immediately.
Okay, and that's because they assured you it was okay at that point?
No, at that time, I was worried about scene safety because there was a large amount of people outside, and with
Okay.
it being a hot zone, I didn't know if the person that caused this harm could be out there.
So you didn't know if it was safer inside or outside?
Yeah, it was very confusing.
I can imagine. And then you call for another backup because of these additional bodies. You call for another ambulance.
Correct.
And that's when EMT Eric Cans and Carrie, I'm not sure if I can read my writing, McCoy,
Correct.
and those were the 2 people that came in the second ambulance.
Correct.
So at this time, there's 2 ambulances totaling 4 people and 2 fire trucks, if that's what they are, with 3 people, correct?
Correct.
And they all come in this shop area at some point, correct?
Correct.
And after you're allowed to come back in, or you come back in because that might be more safe than outside, how many people go back to the office to assess what I think we would stipulate to our Lois and William Cobb?
To my recollection, it was me, or my partner and I, Kylan and I.
Okay, so if the other medics indicated they were back there, you wouldn't remember that or disagree with that, but you don't recall that at
I
this
don't 100% recall. I was very focused on patient care.
Okay. And you've already testified to what you did in the office with Mrs. Cobb and Mr. Cobb. And then they find a 4th body back in the shop.
Correct.
And that person was relatively close to Robert, the first person, but was behind a barricade essentially, so you couldn't see that person.
Correct.
For you to declare somebody dead, I think the phrase in the report was black, you have to call a physician for that determination?
Yes, at Metro Ambulance at that time when I worked there, if we started resuscitative efforts, we needed to get a okay from a physician to stop resuscitative efforts.
Okay. And you did that through calling a Dr. Schmidt.
Yes, I did.
Okay. Now, you prepared a report in connection with this that both you and Kylan Williams signed, correct?
Correct.
And you also were interviewed a couple of days, actually probably a week later on April 9th, by a detective with the Mandan Police Department by the name of Wilmuth.
I don't recall the detective's name.
But you were interviewed and gave a statement.
Correct.
And at some point, somebody took a photograph of the shoes you were wearing as well, correct?
Correct.
And when was that done?
That was shortly after.
The same day or a different day?
It
or-
was the same day.
Okay.
I believe that we had to, I don't remember exactly how long after that call had happened.
Okay, were you still wearing the same shoes, I assume?
Yep.
And it was the same day?
Correct.
All right, would you recognize the written report that is signed by both you and Mr. Williams? At least, I think Williams, the signature on here, yours is a little bit hard to decipher.
Yeah, it's a terrible signature. I'm working on that.
And in that report, you would have indicated who would have been in the shop other than these medical people, right?
I don't exactly recall. I'd have to refer to the report.
All right. If I could approach, Dud?
You may.
Does that look like your report?
Yep, that would be the report.
And that's something that you would have prepared along with Mr. Williams, and you would have reviewed and signed and verified its authenticity and accuracy at the time it was done, correct?
Absolutely.
Is there any indication in there in that first paragraph as to who would have been present when you first arrived?
Yes, there is.
And what does that say?
It said CPR being performed by a bystander.
What does it say about the other persons being present?
Amanda and police officer arrived on scene.
Doesn't it identify in the first part that there were several RJR employees inside the shop?
Yeah, there was a bystander waving to EMS by the shop door.
Okay, and then keep going.
Yeah, there were multiple employees standing in the shop. Okay.
Okay, so there were multiple RJR employees inside the shop, correct?
According to my report, yes. So I'd go with that, yeah.
All right.
I remember what happened a lot more 2.5 years ago than now.
Well, we appreciate that. But you don't disagree that when you prepared this report, right after the events, this would be more closely accurate than something that's 2.5 years later?
I agree with that, yeah.
And you haven't necessarily reviewed these reports in preparation for testimony here?
I have looked at the reports, yes.
Okay. Anything else? That's all I have, Judge. Thank you.
Any redirect?
Yes, Your Honor. Tanner, Mr. Quicks asked you about the number of responders, and the manner in which he asked you that question just makes it seem like it's an endless stream of individuals that was coming to RJR that morning. The period of time in which this response happened, you said you were there for a total of approximately less than 30 minutes, right?
Correct.
And you said that downtime on Robert from the period of time that you stopped working on him until you could actually get back to him was at least 8 minutes, right?
Approximately.
Now, during the course of working on him, how long would you estimate you actually got to work on Robert before you cleared?
I could make a guess, but I don't know the exact amount of time.
And while you were working on Robert, where in the process of performing those resuscitative efforts were you when other individuals were arriving?
Can you be more specific on which individuals?
I guess the fire personnel, law enforcement personnel.
I'd say that was a few minutes after we got there.
Now, you asked for some of those individuals to report, did you not?
Correct, and they also get automatically dispatched per the nature of the call.
And so there's nothing, I guess, out of the ordinary in this specific case as far as other individuals arriving at this crime scene.
No, for who responded is exactly the normal amount of people that would respond when crews are available.
You stated before that your focus was on Robert primarily.
Absolutely.
When other individuals were responding, were they responding to your area near Robert?
Yes, all the individuals came to the patient that we were working on.
And once law enforcement arrived on scene, Mr. Quick just reviewed with you kind of the sequence per your report as to who was there. How long was it until people were escorted out of the RJR premises?
I was not paying attention to who was being brought in, who was being brought out. I was working on taking care of my patient.
How about yourself? How long until you were escorted out of RJR?
Once I got back to Robert and I called Dr. Schmidt, then I left.
You said something a little bit ago about this was the exact number of people that would typically respond or are supposed to respond to this type of incident.
Yes.
Is it typical for fire personnel to essentially back you up in these types of circumstances?
They usually beat us to the call.
Just based on location of where they are in the city? Or?
Yeah.
Okay. As far as anybody who assessed the other individuals, Lois and Bill Cobb or Adam Fuhr, other than yourself, you have no knowledge of that?
No.
At the time that you assessed them, had anybody else, to your knowledge?
I was just told that there were more additional bodies. I wasn't there when they found the bodies initially, so I can't say if they did assess or not.
You use the word they. Are you talking about law enforcement?
Yes, law enforcement.
Okay. Prior to you, did any other paramedic or EMT personnel assess the bodies?
No.
From what you saw or from what you witnessed, as I guess say fire and rescue personnel arrived, other than yourself and Mr. Williams and law enforcement arrived, did they wander from where Robert's body was?
I cannot answer yes or no to that.
With regard to fire personnel, did they clear at the same time as you?
I'm trying to recall back on the events, and I know I was just focused on talking to the physician and getting out of there. I don't know. I didn't have my eyes on them.
Okay. As we sit here today, do you recall whether they were still on scene when you left?
I do not recall.
Okay. Now, Mr. Quick asked you about other individuals, RJR employees, that you noted were inside of RJR. Do you recall that at all as we sit here today?
No.
And even after you looked at the report that Mr. Quick provided to you, are you able to recall that as we sit here today?
I don't recall how many people were in the shop area.
Did you recall anybody in the shop area?
I don't recall an exact amount of people, but there were additional people in there.
And where were those people located?
They were, from what I remember, they were kind of close to the door area.
Until what point?
I don't have an answer to that.
Earlier you said when you left, there were people outside. Had those people already been escorted outside?
I don't recall.
Do you recall whether you had to walk through people to get out the door?
I remember walking, next to people that were there.
Were they also leaving at the same time?
I do not recall.
I don't recall. Of the individuals that you recall being near the door at RJR, did anybody come near where you were working on Robert's body?
No.
Did they follow you to the shop area?
No.
Or excuse me, to the office area?
They did not.
Did they, as far as you can recall, come anywhere near the other bodies that were there?
No.
That's all the questions that I have, Judge.
Any recross?
No, Your Honor. Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you. You may step down.
All right.
Oh, Your Honor, I would ask that Mr. Arthaud be released from his subpoena as well.
Any objection? You are released from your subpoena and you are free to go. Thank you. The state may call its next witness.
I call Kylan Williams, Your Honor.
Please raise your right hand. Do you swear to tell the truth, the whole truth, and nothing but the truth, so help you God? I do. Thank you. Have a seat.
Have a seat, please. State may examine.
Can you please state your full name and occupation for the record?
Kylan Williams. I'm a firefighter with the City of Mandan.
How long have you been a firefighter for the City of Mandan?
Just about 2 years.
Prior to that, what did you do?
I was an EMT with Metro Area Ambulance.
Would that have been true on April 1st, 2019?
Yes.
On that date, who were you working with?
I was partnered with Tanner Arthaud.
And in what capacity were you working with him that day?
He was a paramedic. I was his EMT partner.
How long had you been an EMT at that point?
Approximately 2 years.
And as an EMT, what were your job duties with Metro?
To assist whichever paramedic I was partnered with responding to 911 calls, offering medical treatment for any patients that call for help.
Do you remember taking a call to RJR Maintenance and Management on April 1st, 2019?
I do.
Do you remember what time that was?
I believe it was 7:28 when the call came out.
Do you remember who was with you on that date?
Tanner Arthaud.
What information do you recall that you had as you were dispatched to RJR?
We were dispatched for unresponsive male.
Did you respond code? Do you remember?
We did. We responded code 3, which is lights and sirens.
Okay. And what do you, I guess, do you remember arriving at the RJR building that day?
I do.
How did you know where to go?
As we went around the back side, which would have been the west side, I believe, there was a individual standing by a door leading into the shop waiting for us.
Do you know who that individual was?
I do not.
Do you know whether he worked at RJR?
I'm not sure.
Okay. Wasn't a law enforcement officer?
No.
Okay. Wasn't another paramedic?
No.
Okay. When you arrived at RJR, what did you do?
We had been advised by dispatch that there was CPR in progress. We parked the ambulance, acquired the appropriate medical equipment, and followed the individual through the door into the shop.
And when you did that, what did you first see? What did you first observe?
Off to the left-hand side as we walked in, there was a person performing CPR on a downed individual.
Do you know who that downed individual was?
We learned it was Robert Faulkner.
Do you know who was performing CPR on him?
I did not at the time.
Okay. What did you do when you arrived and you saw that somebody was doing CPR?
We immediately went to the patient, assessed for pulses, and took over CPR for the individual that was performing it.
Who performed chest compressions?
I did.
Did you make any assessments while you were doing chest compressions?
Nothing aside from when we first got to him checking for a pulse. Once I took over chest compressions, I just focused on that while Mr. Arthaud began cutting away the shirt to expose the chest.
When you checked for a pulse, did you find a pulse?
We did not.
Were there any signs of life in Robert Faulkner at the time that you responded?
There was not. There were no pulse and absent breaths.
Other than CPR, did you take any other life-saving measures?
Over the course of the call, with as far as taking over airway and assisting ventilations, but initially when we first got to him, it was focused on getting him on the defibrillator and chest compressions.
Did you notice anything that appeared abnormal to you in responding to this call?
A very large amount of blood.
Why was that abnormal to you?
Generally on a cardiac arrest call, which is what we assumed we were walking into, you don't have a large amount of blood.
When you arrived on scene and you entered RJR with Tanner, who was there other than the individual performing CPR and the individual on the floor?
The individual that met us at the door as well. Beyond that, I didn't really notice if there was anybody else.
Did you see anybody else?
Not that I recall.
As you were performing chest compressions on Robert, did you at any point look around?
We did. After Tanner exposed the chest, we noted some puncture wounds to the chest, and we looked around the shop to see if we could determine anything that could have caused those types of injuries.
At that time, did you see anything that could have caused those types of injuries?
Nothing that stood out, no.
Did you see anybody else standing around in RJR?
Not that I recall, but I wasn't really looking for that.
Did you ever stop working on Robert Faulkner?
We did.
And why did that happen?
Police had discovered additional bodies in the front office area of the shop.
Do you remember how long after you had arrived on scene that happened?
I'm not sure.
When law enforcement discovered additional bodies, what did you do?
We immediately went to clear the scene until police could secure and ensure that it was in fact safe for us to continue.
When you say clear the scene, where did you go?
Just back out the shop door to the outside area.
You and Tanner both?
Yes.
Was anybody with you at that time?
We had fire personnel with us.
How soon after you arrived did fire personnel arrive on scene?
2 to 3 minutes, maybe.
And when they arrived on scene, what were they doing?
The first fireman that arrived on scene began working on the patient's airway and assisting ventilations.
So assisted you in resuscitative efforts regarding
Yes.
Robert? When law enforcement cleared RJR, were you allowed back in to the building?
Yes.
What did you do at that time?
Law enforcement directed us to the office area where they had discovered additional bodies, and Tanner and I went into the office to check for any signs of life on either of the patients in there.
So you accompanied law enforcement?
Yes. Well, after they had been in there, yes.
Okay. And who did you assess?
We both assessed briefly both of the patients that were in there. I'm not sure the names.
And we're talking about in the office area?
In the office, yes.
Okay. Do you remember genders?
One male, one female.
Okay. And who did you go to first?
If I recall correctly, I went to the male first and Tanner went to the female. And after we had each checked for pulses, we kind of crossed paths to double check each other's.
What was the result of your assessments of those two individuals?
Both pulseless, not breathing, injuries incompatible with life.
When you say injuries incompatible with life, what do you mean?
The extent of their injuries, it was too extreme for somebody to survive that.
There was nothing you could do at that point?
Correct.
When you assessed the two individuals in, excuse me, I'm not talking to the microphone. When you assessed the two individuals in the office area, did you notice anything about their bodies?
Notice anything as far as,
Did you make any observations?
aside from their injuries?
And what were their injuries that you noticed?
The male had large amount of blood on his shirt. We exposed his chest and noted multiple penetrating injuries.
And where was the male situated in the office area?
If I recall correctly, he was to the immediate left in a smaller room or office.
Do you remember if he was laying, sitting?
Kind of half in between, slumped, mostly on his back, but slumped up slightly against a wall or a desk. I don't remember which.
Okay. And the female?
Female was lying on her back in, I believe it was a bathroom.
Did you notice anything about her injuries?
She had very deep lacerations to her throat.
After assessing the two people in the office area, what do you recall doing next?
After we had assessed those two, law enforcement had advised us that there was a fourth patient in the shop area, and we exited back to the shop area to assess that patient.
And when you assessed that patient, what did you do?
He was lying on his front, so we log rolled him onto his back to assess for pulses, and he was pulseless. Rigor mortis had begun to set in. He was injuries incompatible with life.
Do you know who that individual was?
I'm not sure which.
At the time that you assessed him, you used the pronoun we. Who was with you at that time?
It was myself and Tanner Arthaud, and I believe Clayton Schaff from the fire department.
So when you say you log rolled that fourth individual onto his back, Clayton Schaff would have been with you at that time?
If I recall correctly, yes.
While you were assessing the other two that were in the office area, were any fire personnel with you at that time?
In the office area, you said? That I don't recall.
So other than yourself and Tanner, you don't recall anybody else being in there?
Law enforcement, but I'm not sure if any if any fire were with us.
After checking each of the four individuals for vitals, what did you do?
We ensured that PD was okay with us to clear scene, and we collected what equipment we could and cleared the scene.
Did you, to your recollection, take anything with you that didn't belong to you?
We did not.
Did you leave anything behind?
Just the defibrillator pads and patches on Robert that we'd worked. I believe they may have left the BVM, and Tanner had established an IO at one point, which we left in place.
Can you explain what those two things are?
BVM is a bag valve mask for assisting ventilations, and an IO is intraosseous, so IV access but into the bone.
While you were working on Mr. Faulkner and then you went to assess the other 3 individuals, were you wearing gloves?
Yes.
Was Tanner wearing gloves?
Yes.
When Mr. Schaff from Mandan Fire joined you, was he wearing gloves?
Yes.
Is that standard practice for
It
you?
is.
As you were leaving RJR Maintenance and Management, did you notice whether there was anybody else other than fire and medical and law enforcement personnel inside?
There was a cluster of people kind of at the end of the parking lot by the street. I'm not sure who all they were, but there were some bystanders.
At any point, did you see any of those individuals inside the shop?
I vaguely recall as we were working on Mr. Faulkner, there were, out of my peripherals, I saw a couple people coming and going. I wasn't sure if it was law enforcement or who until I heard a female start crying and screaming.
Do you know who that individual was?
I do not.
And when you say coming and going, walking in the door and walking back out,
Yes.
that same shop door?
Yes.
The individuals that you said that you saw at the edge of the parking lot and that the female that you could hear screaming, did any of those individuals other than rescue personnel approach the bodies to your recollection?
No.
Did any of those individuals hover or stand over you while you were attempting life-saving efforts?
Not that I recall, no.
Were you cleared from the scene by law enforcement?
We were.
At that time, did you notice that there was anybody standing in the entryway of the RJR premises?
Not that I recall.
Mr. Williams, were you interviewed in regard to this case?
I was.
Do you remember when that occurred?
I believe it was a couple of days after the incident.
Do you remember who interviewed you?
I do not.
At that time, did you provide your boots, your work boots?
Not at that time. The day of the incident, we returned to the scene for police to take pictures and measurements of our boots.
And when you say we, who are you talking about?
Mr. Arthaud and I.
So you returned to the scene on April 1st, 2019 for that to happen?
Correct.
What type of shoes do you wear, or boots do you wear?
It's like black zip up on the side for easy to pull on and off.
Like tactical boots?
Similar, yes.
That's all the questions I have of this witness, Judge.
Cross-exam, Mr. Quick?
Yes, thanks, Judge. Just have a few questions, Mr. Williams. Essentially, you went to RJR for a medical emergency, correct?
Yes, sir.
You didn't expect to find a crime scene,
No, sir.
and you're not trained to do a crime scene assessment or crime scene preservation or anything of the nature, correct?
Correct.
And so you're not wearing booties over your shoes or protective clothing, anything of that nature.
Correct.
That would be foolish to take the time to don that special equipment to go into a medical alert, correct?
Correct.
And you frankly were there within just minutes.
Yes, sir.
And there were several other rescuers that responded as well, firefighters and another ambulance crew, correct?
Correct.
Do you remember who was all there?
With the fire department, it would have been Derek Berger, Clayton Schaff, and Steve Kylan. The other ambulance crew was Eric Kahns and Kerry McCoy.
And they all responded separately, not everyone, but there were 4 crews, correct? For a
Correct.
total of 7 people. And I'm sorry, I didn't let you answer that last one.
Yes, correct.
And interspersed with the responders, first responders coming, law enforcement is showing up individually as well. At least 3 Mandan police officers, correct?
Yes,
And they're the ones that ultimately find 2 additional bodies in the office and then tell you the scene's not secure, and that requires you and everybody else to essentially leave the building for a short time.
correct.
You did prepare a report in this case shortly after it occurred, and it was signed off by both you and Tanner, is that correct?
Yes, sir.
And in there, you indicate when you arrived, there was somebody waving to you by the shop door, And when you got into the shop, there were multiple employees standing in the shop. Do you recall that?
I don't recall that.
Would it help you to refresh your memory if you reviewed your report?
I'm sorry, I should rephrase that. I don't recall the bystanders inside. I do remember reading that in the report. I just don't remember. That was quite some time ago.
Okay. I assume you would agree that when you wrote the report, it would have been accurate.
Yes.
Okay. And so it's likely that there were multiple RGR employees standing in the shop.
Likely.
Honey, you agree with that?
Yes, sir.
That's all I have, Judge. Thank you.
Any redirect?
Yes, Your Honor. Mr. Williams, Mr. Quick just asked you about bystanders in the doorway of the RJR shop, and you stated you didn't recall that.
Correct.
You've reviewed your report, and you still don't recall that as we sit here today.
Correct.
You had stated earlier in your testimony, though, that you heard a female and that some individuals had been coming and going from the doorway area.
Yes.
As far as you know, other than fire and rescue personnel, did anybody make it substantially into the building that day?
I couldn't tell you how far in.
When you were clearing the shop area and assessing the bodies in the shop area and then again in the office, did you encounter any bystanders at those times?
No.
That's all the questions I have, Judge.
Any recross?
No, thank you.
Thank you. You may step down.
Your Honor, I'd also ask that Mr. Williams be released.
Okay.
You are released from your subpoena and you are free to go. Thank you. The state may call its next witness.
Call Clayton Schaff, Your Honor.
Mr. Schaff, if you would come forward right up here and raise your right hand, please.
Do you swear the testimony you're about to give will be the truth, the whole truth, and nothing but the truth, so help you God?
I do.
Thank you. Have a seat.
Have a seat, please. State may examine.
Can you please state your full name and your occupation for the record?
Clayton Schaff with the Mandan Fire Department.
Can you spell your last name?
SCHAFF.
Thank you. How long have you worked for the Mandan Fire Department?
12 plus years.
And in what capacity do you work for the fire department?
A firefighter EMT.
Do you have, I guess, what training goes into being a firefighter and an EMT?
A lot of hours of fire suppression activities, as well as on the EMS side, it's basic life support.
And is working as an EMT or responding to calls in that capacity, is that sort of a routine part of your job?
It is.
So if a medical call comes in and there's a dispatch out, is Mandan Fire responding to those as well as metro area?
That's correct.
Okay. Do you remember taking a call to RJR Maintenance and Management here in Mandan on April 1st, 2019?
I do.
Do you remember what time you were dispatched on that call?
Roughly between 7:15 and 7:30.
Do you remember who was with you that day?
Captain Steve Kylan.
When you were dispatched on that call, what information did you have?
So actually our Station 2 was dispatched to that area to assist Metro. Captain Steve Kylan and myself went down to back him up as well as drive the fire truck back to the station as we normally would do. All we knew at that point was it was a cardiac arrest. At a certain point we upgraded to lights and sirens to assist Metro as well as Engine 21.
Okay. You said that your Station 2 had responded. Is that one individual or more than one individual?
One individual and one engine.
Okay. And you said you went to back that individual up.
Correct.
Okay. And who was that individual that day?
Derek Berger.
Okay. So at the time that you were responding, Derek had already responded?
That's correct.
And Metro had responded?
That's also correct.
So why did you also respond?
As I stated, we went down there primarily to get the fire truck and take it back to the station because Derek Berger would have rode in Metro ambulance, possibly on a cardiac arrest to assist Metro, so we could get that engine back to its station.
Is all of that somewhat routine?
Yes.
At what point did that change?
When we got down there, they were still on scene working the cardiac arrest, so we proceeded inside to assist.
Did you take anything inside with you?
Just some gloves, normal gloves, I guess, to assist.
Do you remember which door you went into RJR?
Yeah, it'd be the shop door, which is kind of in the southwest corner of the building.
And as you entered that shop door, was Mr. Kylan with you?
He was.
I'm sorry, what was his rank again?
He was a captain.
Okay. And was Captain Kylan with you the whole time that you were on scene?
He was.
Okay. When you entered that shop door, what did you first encounter?
When we walked in, we saw one patient laying supine on his back. There was a couple Metro personnel working CPR, and then Derek Berger himself was down assisting them as well. I believe there was one officer on location as well.
And what was that officer doing?
At the time, I guess I can't recall.
Do you remember where he was in RJR?
In close proximity to the patient.
Okay. Were there any RJR employees standing inside at that time?
I can't say yes or no.
Did you have to walk through anybody as you came through the door?
I don't recall.
As you entered and you saw the individual laying supine on the floor, what did you do next?
Captain Kylan and myself assisted Metro by doing CPR, and then I believe we spiked the IV bag to assist Metro, and that's primarily what we did. We helped get things out of their medical bag to assist.
As they were primarily occupied with life-saving or resuscitative efforts on that individual, do you know who that individual was that was laying supine on the floor?
I didn't at the time.
Do you know now?
Robert.
And did you make any assessments of Robert or the area that you were standing in when you responded?
I did. That, to me, I guess is what stands out the most. There was some broken eggs, looked like a bag of something had been spilled. And then, aside from that, I saw a fair amount of blood for a cardiac arrest, so it triggered a response, I guess, that something wasn't quite right.
Were there any signs of life, to your knowledge, in Robert while you were there, or when you had arrived on scene?
No, at that point not, and Metro had said he was asystole on the monitor.
When did you leave the area near Robert?
We left that area after we were informed that there was a second patient.
Where did you go at that time?
At that point, we stood up and we walked to the northwest corner of the building, which would be kind of back by the offices or front offices of that building. I guess, who informed you that there was another patient? I can't say for sure who actually made the comment.
Do you know what entity?
I believe it was the police department.
Okay. And at that time, were you cued to help that patient?
We followed Metro Ambulance back there. Once they walked in, we also proceeded with them, I guess.
So when you say you followed Metro Ambulance, you mean Tanner and Kylan?
That's correct.
Okay. So as you enter the office area, what do you recall seeing?
I remember seeing a lot of blood and trauma. I remember seeing a fire extinguisher that had been knocked off the wall.
And what area of the office are we talking about here?
I can't say for sure exactly where.
When you said there had been a lot of blood and trauma, whom are you talking about?
Mrs. Cobb.
Okay. Do you remember what trauma you saw on Mrs. Cobb?
Severe neck trauma.
Okay. Was Mrs. Cobb alive or dead at the time that you saw her?
I did not check for a pulse, but I was informed and she did look to be deceased.
What was your purpose in following behind Kylan and Tanner?
At that point, we didn't know if the patients were savable or not, so we went back to assist as we normally would. It became a triage situation, so if we could help in any way, that's what we would have done.
When you walked back into the shop area, or excuse me, the office area with Tanner and with Kylan and with Captain Kylan, were you wearing gloves?
Yes, we would have been wearing gloves, yeah.
And your standard uniforms?
Correct.
As you would on pretty much any call?
I'm sorry, what was
As
that?
you would on pretty much any call?
Yes.
Okay. Did you actually touch Lois Cobb's body?
I don't believe I did.
Now, when you mentioned a fire extinguisher, was that in the same area as Mrs. Cobb?
I can't say for sure exactly where it was.
Okay. Did you assess Mr. Cobb at any point?
I did not physically touch him. I can't even say I remember looking at him that much because at that point it was obvious something was wrong, and Metro Ambulance had already kind of assessed the patient, so we did not. I did not.
Do you remember, you said you didn't assess him with regard to touch him at all. Do you remember where he was positioned?
I don't.
Okay. Now, getting back to this fire extinguisher, why did the fire extinguisher get your attention that day with everything else going on?
Well, I think right away it started off with the cardiac arrest. The fact that there was looked to be lacerations on his chest or puncture wounds, some trauma in his airway causing blood. So that's already triggered us to think there's something else going on. And then when we go back to see Mrs. Cobb, that kind of set us back as well. And then I think it was at that point, I guess, that we decided to just walk away from it. We weren't going to assess that patient any longer. That answers.
You mean Mrs. Cobb?
Mrs. Cobb, yeah.
Yeah.
And Mr. Cobb, I didn't really look at.
At that point, there was nothing you could do for those individuals.
Absolutely not.
Getting back to the fire extinguisher, when you saw it, I guess, why did that get your attention?
Just because it was out of place. It wasn't mounted on the wall as it normally would. It seems to me I remember the hose being out of its holder, like it had been maybe used in a self-defense sort of fashion.
And you said that it wasn't mounted on the wall. Do you remember where it was? Was it on a desk or a chair?
It was on the floor, tipped over.
Now, after being in the office area, what did you do next?
After that, we proceeded out, and roughly about that same time frame, we were notified there was a fourth body found in the shop. So we proceeded back to that area as well. And the patient was laying away from us, and we had to log roll him backwards so we could assess him.
When you say we, who are you talking about?
Metro Ambulance was there. I can't say particularly which individual it was from Metro, and then my captain, Steve Kylan, was also beside me and or behind me, I guess.
So who actually put hands on that fourth individual?
I know I had my hands on him, roughly waist, in his waist area, I guess, and then we logged him over. The Metro Ambulance was more towards the head portion. They assessed for pulses.
Okay. And what was the condition of that fourth individual, Mr. Fear?
I'm sorry, can you repeat the question?
What was the condition of that fourth individual, Mr. Fear, when you got to him?
Obviously deceased. Seemed like a certain amount of rigor had already taken place. Seemed like he had been down for some time.
Did you make any other observations about Mr. Fear's person at that time?
No, I did not.
How long would you estimate that you were on scene that day on April 1st, 2019?
It would be in our report, but if you're asking me, I would say roughly 20 minutes.
And in that period of time, did you have to exit the scene at any point?
Yeah, at that point, after the fourth patient was found, I exited the building, as well as my captain, and I guess I don't recall going back in. I might have stepped in once to lay my gloves on the floor.
Why did you do that?
Because at that point it was a obvious crime scene, and I didn't want to take anything with me, so I left the gloves there since they would have been contaminated with the scene, and we walked out.
Is that something that you would normally do in encountering a crime scene like this?
Normally don't encounter crime scenes, so I can't really say, but that's what popped into my mind that day.
Okay. Have you been at crime scenes before?
Not like this.
Okay. Now I hate to take you in a circuitous route here, but I have a follow-up question with regard to the area of Robert Faulkner's body. Did you notice anything that seemed out of place in the area near his body?
No, I can't say that I did. He just was laying supine on the floor near a bench. Obviously the broken eggs that we discussed. Looked like he had been carrying something and had fallen down.
what types of, it's kind of a weird question, so I apologize. What types of shoes were you wearing that day?
Be the same shoes that I'd be wearing today. They're Thorogoods, ankle high with square tread.
Can you show the jury what those look like, please?
I can.
Now, are those shoes kind of a standard footwear for people in your position?
That's correct.
And when you say square treads, what are you talking about?
Just the treads on the bottom of my shoe.
They're angular.
Sure.
Can you show the jury what the
I can.
treads? I apologize. Now, your shoes or your boots that you've just shown the jury, similar to the ones you were wearing on April 1st, 2019, were you asked to produce those for footprints at any point?
Yeah, later on that afternoon, we were called back in. We handed our boots off to, I believe, a detective. They took some pictures and they were handed back to us.
Other than the things that we've already talked about here this afternoon, was there anything else that really got your attention about the RJR scene itself?
The amount of gruesome killings, and it seemed like the time frame that we were there, it seemed incredible and thought out. I felt like there was too much done in a short amount of time.
That's all the questions that I do have for Mr. Schaff, Judge.
Cross-exam?
Just a few questions, Your Honor. Thank you. Mr. Schaff, there were a couple of questions asked of you, and you said this wasn't a normal scene, and this is not something you would normally encounter. Is that true?
That's correct.
In fact, when you made a statement to law enforcement later, I think you described it two different ways. You said we were all kind of a deer in the headlights. Do you remember saying that?
I don't remember.
Would that be an accurate assessment of what you saw that day?
Absolutely.
And then there was another statement you made that you needed time to get your wits together. Would that also be an accurate statement?
If that's what's in the statement, yes.
Because that's kind of how you felt.
Yeah, I was very surprised and shocked.
In addition to, you talked about yourself and your captain and the metro scene that was already there, and you talked about Fireman Berger as well. Isn't it true another metro ambulance came as well?
That's correct, yeah.
And do you remember the time sequence when they arrived?
I do not.
And that would have been Eric Cans and Carrie McCoy?
Okay.
I'm just asking, I'm not trying to tell you.
I know Carrie was there. I don't know the Eric.
Okay. But you know there was a fourth rescue vehicle.
Yeah, there was a secondary ambulance that pulled up, correct?
And they would have done something in the scene as well, correct?
Sure.
They would have gone into the shop, I assume.
I don't know. I didn't watch them.
Okay, so you're not certain what they did?
No.
All right. And when you went up to the shop with the captain and the first metro crew, what happened to Fireman Berger?
Well, as Captain Kylan and I were in the shop, Berger and the first metro crew were already on scene working with the first patient. So we walked up to them to assist the patient, or with the patient.
Well, I'm sorry, I probably misstated my question. After you were in the shop, you eventually went to the office.
That's correct.
And who all went to the office? You indicated you, your captain, the first metro crew. Did Derek Berger go with you at that time as well?
I can't say for sure.
And you're not sure if the second ambulance crew went up there as well?
I don't know.
Okay. So you ultimately came back to the scene at the request of somebody from the police department, and they took photographs of your shoes?
That's correct.
Was there blood on your shoes at that time from being in the crime scene?
I guess I wouldn't know. I don't know. We got off duty at 8 o'clock that morning, and I hadn't seen my shoes since I responded back to the scene. I did not look at the soles of my shoes.
Okay. They were not in any way tested to your knowledge. They just simply took a photograph.
I'm not sure what they did with them.
Okay. That's all I have, Judge. Thank you.
Redirect?
Yes. Mr. Schaff, you testified earlier that there were a number of people that responded to this scene, and it was pretty standard.
Yep.
Looking back, with hindsight, sometimes things become a little bit clearer. Is there anything that happened that morning from an emergency response perspective that wasn't appropriate?
No, I think as far as the fire department was concerned, we followed protocol and procedure.
And did you see anybody not following procedure that morning?
I did not.
That's all the questions that I have, Judge.
Any recross?
No, Your Honor, thank you.
Thank you. You may step down.
Thank you.
We also have no objection if he's excused.
Can you be excused?
I would ask that you, yes.
You're released from your subpoena and you are free to go. Thank you.
Sir?
We've been going about an hour and 20 minutes, so we'll take our first recess of the afternoon. Again, please heed the admonition to not discuss the case amongst yourselves or with anyone else. Do not form or express any opinions about the case until it's given to you for your determination. We'll be recessed for 15 minutes if you follow the bailiff out. When I say 15 minutes, I like to have the jury back here and ready to come back in 15 minutes so that we're not taking longer than that. I know they have to